They set him up with the CEO as a joke, never once imagining that in 6 months she'd be the reason half of them still had jobs. Jack Coleman didn't know that yet. Neither did she. What he knew, standing outside the amber room in a jacket that still smelled faintly of his daughter's strawberry shampoo from the hug she'd given him at the door, was that his friends had picked the wrong night to mess with him, and the wrong woman to underestimate. Nobody at that table had any idea they were about to hand a prank blind date to a man who'd once talked a room full of armed men down without raising his voice, and none of them, not Marcus, not Dana, not even Jack himself, had any idea that the woman waiting inside wasn't just some name off an app. She was Vivian Hale. The Vivian Hale, CEO of Halewell Group, a woman 3 of his friends' companies quietly answered to, and none of them had bothered to check the name before deciding she'd make a good joke. If stories about people finding out exactly who they underestimated are the kind you love, stay close. This one earns it. Jack wasn't supposed to be here. 6 months ago, he'd made himself a promise. Work, Lily, wrestling practice, repeat. No dating apps, no setups. Nothing that could complicate the quiet life he'd built since he came home for good. He fixed cars on weekends and coached teenagers how to fall without breaking. And if anyone asked what he used to do, he said, logistics, and let them assume something boring. Only Marcus knew there was more to it than that, and even Marcus didn't know how much more. Tonight, Marcus had promised him free wings and a Cardinals game. Instead, Jack was standing outside a restaurant with white tablecloths, texting a woman named Vivian, who thought this was a real date arranged by a mutual friend, and Jack was starting to understand, with a slow, sinking clarity, that he was the punchline. He pushed the door open anyway. Somebody had to tell her the truth, and it wasn't going to be over text. She was easy to find. Corner table, back straight, hands folded on the linen like she'd learned a long time ago not to fidget in public. She looked up when he came in, and Jack watched her do the thing he recognized instantly because he did it himself. A fast, practiced scan, cataloging exits, cataloging him, deciding in under 2 seconds whether tonight was going to be another disappointment to survive politely. "You must be Jack." Her voice was warm, but there was armor under it, the kind that came from years of people deciding things about her before she opened her mouth. "I am, and I owe you an apology before we even sit down." He didn't sit. "I don't think this was set up the way you think it was." Something flickered across her face. Not hurt yet, just calculation. "Go on." "My friend Marcus thought it'd be funny to put me on a date with someone he assumed I'd never actually show up for." Jack kept his voice even, the same voice he used to talk nervous 15-year-olds through their first real match. "I didn't know your name until an hour ago. I didn't know anything about you. I just knew my friends were laughing about it in a group chat I wasn't supposed to see." He watched her absorb that, watched her decide, in real time, whether to be furious or to laugh, and land somewhere colder and more familiar. The tired, practiced patience of someone who'd been the joke before. "Let me guess," she said. "Big CEO, must be desperate, must be an easy laugh." Something like that. Jack finally sat, because leaving felt like proving Marcus right, and because, though he wouldn't have admitted this yet, not even to himself, he didn't actually want to leave. "For what it's worth, I don't know who you are, not your company, not your title. Just that you didn't deserve to sit here alone, because a few guys thought it'd be a funny story tomorrow." Vivian studied him for a long moment. In her world, everyone knew exactly who she was before they sat down, knew the number attached to her name, knew which favors they wanted, knew how to arrange their faces into whatever expression would get them furthest. Nobody looked at her like she was just a stranger having a bad night. It unsettled her more than the joke had. "You really don't know," she said slowly. "Should I?" "No." Something in her shoulders eased, just slightly. "Actually, for tonight, let's keep it that way." They ordered coffee instead of dinner, because neither of them trusted the evening enough yet to commit to an entree, and somewhere between the second cup and her first real laugh, surprised out of her at something dry he said about his daughter's wrestling team refusing to lose to a school with a nicer mascot, the whole thing stopped feeling like damage control and started feeling like something else. She asked about the daughter, Lily, 7, missing her 2 front teeth and completely convinced her dad could fix anything, including, last week, a broken kite, a broken bike chain, and, her words, a broken feeling, which had turned out to just be a bad day that a grilled cheese sandwich cut into triangles had mostly solved. Jack told the story without meaning to make himself look good, and that, more than anything, was what made Vivian lean forward instead of checking her phone. "You coach wrestling," she said. "On top of, what did you say? Logistics? Something like that." He turned his water glass a quarter turn, a small, contained motion, the kind of stillness that came from a lot of practice at not giving anything away. Vivian noticed it. She noticed most things. It was half of why she was good at her job, and half of why she was so tired of her job. But she let it go, because for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, she wasn't sitting across from someone doing math about her. 2 tables over, a phone buzzed against wood, and the woman holding it glanced up sharply at Vivian, then quickly away, the kind of double-take Jack had seen 1,000 times in a different context and knew exactly how to read. Somebody had recognized her. Vivian didn't seem to notice or chose not to. Jack filed it away without comment, the way he filed everything away, an old habit that had never fully switched off no matter how many years passed. "Can I ask you something?" Vivian said, quieter now, some of the polish gone from her voice. "Does it bother you?" Being the joke tonight? Jack thought about it honestly before he answered, because she deserved honesty and not comfort. "It did. For about 10 minutes in the parking lot," he admitted. "Then I figured, better to walk in and find out I was wrong about the joke than walk away and never find out I might have been wrong about you." Vivian didn't have a quick answer for that. For a woman who ran board meetings with the confidence of someone who'd never once been unsure of herself in public, she looked, just for a moment, entirely unguarded, like someone had finally said something true to her instead of something useful. Neither of them noticed Marcus watching from the bar across the street, phone raised, already typing an update to the group chat that would, within the hour, reach exactly the wrong set of ears that reported, eventually, all the way up to people who worked for Vivian Hale and who were about to learn, in ways none of them expected, that laughing at the wrong dinner date could cost a great deal more than they'd bargained for. Jack walked her to her car 40 minutes later, and if either of them had known what the next 6 months would unravel, the layers under his quiet coaching and logistics cover story, the reasons her board had been circling her for a vulnerability they thought made her weak, the storm neither of them saw coming from opposite directions, they might have said something different at the curb. Instead, Vivian just said, "Same time next week?" And Jack, against every promise he'd made himself 6 months ago, said yes. Marcus's text arrived the next morning, while Jack was flipping pancakes with one hand and combing knots out of Lily's hair with the other. Bro, do you know who that was?" Jack read it twice, set his phone face down on the counter, and told himself it didn't matter. It mattered anyway, the way a splinter mattered, small, buried, impossible to ignore once you knew it was there. "Is that about your date?" Lily asked, spinning on the stool with the particular nosiness of a 7-year-old who had learned that adults said more when they thought you weren't listening. "It's about a friend being nosy," Jack said, and flipped the pancake a little too hard. "Was she nice?" "She was nice." He set the plate in front of her, and something in his voice must have given him away, because Lily studied him the way she studied broken kites, like a problem she intended to solve. "You're smiling weird," she informed him. He was. He hadn't noticed until she said it. By the time he dropped her at school and got to the garage, Marcus was already leaning against the bay door, arms crossed, grinning like a man who'd found gold. "Vivian Hale," he said, before Jack even had his toolbox open. "Man, Vivian Hale, Halewell Group. You know how much business that woman controls? My cousin's firm does contract work for one of her subsidiaries. She's not just rich, Jack. She runs half the logistics infrastructure on the East Coast." "I know what she does," Jack said, which was only mostly true. He knew the name now. He didn't know the shape of it yet, how big, how far it reached, how much weight sat behind that quiet, careful posture she'd had at the table. "You know what this means, right?" Marcus lowered his voice like he was sharing something sacred. "This means the joke backfired spectacular. You actually like her." Jack didn't answer that, mostly because it was true, and he wasn't ready to hand Marcus the satisfaction. He ducked under the hood of a Civic instead, and let the silence do the talking, which had always worked better for him than words did anyway. Across town, Vivian sat in a glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor, half listening to a quarterly projections meeting she could have recited in her sleep, and found herself thinking about a man who had turned a water glass a quarter turn instead of fidgeting and hadn't once looked at his phone. Ms. Hale, her CFO, Robert Ashworth, was watching her with the faint, patient impatience of a man used to being the smartest person in most rooms and resenting anyone who made him wait. "Your thoughts on the Q3 numbers?" "They're fine," she said, which was not an answer, and everyone in the room knew it, and no one said so, because that was how it worked when you were the one paying salaries. Robert's mouth did something small and satisfied, filed away for later. Vivian had learned to read that look years ago, the look of a man collecting reasons. She didn't know yet what he intended to do with them. She only knew, in the vague, itching way she knew most threats before she could name them, that Robert had been circling something for months, watching for a moment when the board might start asking whether Vivian Hale was still the right person to run the company her own father had built. "Too soft lately," she'd overheard once, through a door not quite closed. Distracted. Not as sharp. She hadn't been distracted. She'd been exhausted, in the specific, bone-deep way that came from spending a decade being underestimated in every room she walked into. Too big for the boardroom photographs the PR team preferred, too visible for some, too invisible for others, judged before she'd said a single word about margins or growth strategy. She had built armor for that a long time ago. She hadn't expected a stranger with kind eyes and a bad blind date setup to slip past it in under an hour. After the meeting, her assistant, Priya, lingered by the door. "You seem different today," Priya said carefully. "Good different." "Do I?" "You smiled at Robert's terrible joke about supply chains. You never smile at Robert's jokes." Vivian didn't answer that either, but she didn't stop smiling, and Priya, who had worked for her for 6 years and knew better than to push, simply nodded and let her have it. The second date happened at a diner instead of the Amber Room. Jack's suggestion, low-key on purpose, and Vivian had agreed so fast it surprised them both. She showed up in jeans and an oversized sweater, no security trailing her, no assistant hovering with a schedule. And Jack understood, without her having to explain it, that this was a kind of gift. She'd left the armor at the office. "No entourage tonight?" he asked, sliding into the booth across from her. "I gave everyone the slip," she said. "Don't tell my security team. They'll have a meeting about it. Your secret's safe." He meant it as a joke and heard, only after he'd said it, how it might land differently, how secrets seemed to be the theme of the week for both of them, though neither said so out loud. They talked for 2 hours over coffee that went cold, and pie neither of them finished. She told him about her father, the man who'd built Halewell out of a single warehouse and 3 trucks, who used to bring her to job sites as a kid and let her sit in the cab of an 18-wheeler like it was a throne. She told him, carefully, In the roundabout way, people told the truths that still hurt, that after he died and she took over, half the board had spent the first 2 years waiting for her to fail, quietly betting, in ways she wasn't supposed to know about, on how long the daughter would last. "They didn't say it to my face," she said. "They didn't have to." Jack listened the way he'd learned to listen to scared recruits and grieving families both, without rushing to fix it, without making it about himself. "People do that," he said finally. "Decide who you are before they've done the work of finding out. You'd know something about that?" It was a question, gentle, testing, and Jack felt the shape of his own secret sitting heavy behind his ribs. The years he didn't talk about, the things Lily's mother had known, and no one since. He thought about telling her. He thought about how good it would feel to stop being careful for one night. "Something like that," he said instead, and watched a flicker of disappointment cross her face before she smoothed it away. Too polite, or too used to people not telling her things, to push. 2 days later, Jack was in the garage bay, elbow deep in a transmission, when a black sedan pulled up outside, the kind that didn't belong on this block, with tinted windows and a driver who stayed put with the engine running. A man in a gray suit got out instead, unhurried, scanning the garage like he was pricing it. "Jack Coleman?" The man's voice had the flat, professional courtesy of someone used to being obeyed. "Robert Ashworth. I work with Vivian Hale." Jack wiped his hands on a rag, slow and deliberate, buying himself a second to read the room the way he read every room now out of old habit. "Can I help you with something?" "I just wanted to meet the man Vivian's been having dinner with." Robert's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Logistics, is it? Fascinating career." "Tell me, which firm?" The question landed exactly where it was meant to, a small, precise test, and Jack felt the old instinct rise in him, the one that used to keep men alive in rooms far more dangerous than this. Answer wrong, give too much, and this man would find out things Jack had spent 6 years making sure no one found out. "Independent," Jack said evenly. "I mostly work with my hands these days." Robert's eyes flicked, just briefly, to the tattoo on Jack's forearm, faded, half covered by his sleeve. A small insignia most people wouldn't recognize and wouldn't think to ask about. Robert's gaze lingered there half a second too long before he looked away. "I'm sure you do," he said pleasantly, in the tone of a man who had just learned something and intended to use it. "Take care, Mr. Coleman. Vivian's board cares a great deal about who she associates with. Wouldn't want anything complicated attaching itself to her name." He got back in the car without waiting for a response, and Jack stood in the open bay door long after the sedan pulled away, the wrench still loose in his hand, understanding with a cold, familiar clarity that whatever this was between him and Vivian, it had just stopped being simple for both of them. Vivian found out about Robert's visit to the garage the way she found out about most things that mattered, sideways, late, and from the wrong person. "He did what?" she said, standing in her office with her phone pressed hard to her ear. Priya hovering by the door with the particular stillness of someone who already regretted being the one to mention it. "Drove out there himself," Priya said. "One of the interns saw it on his calendar. Coleman, informal, no other context." Vivian closed her eyes. She could picture it exactly. Robert's unhurried walk, his practiced pleasantness, the way he collected information like other men collected watches, quietly and for the pleasure of owning it. She'd watched him do it to vendors, to junior staff, to anyone whose footing wasn't quite solid enough to push back. She hadn't expected him to do it to Jack. She hadn't expected to feel this particular flavor of fury on someone else's behalf, sharp and immediate, nothing like the tired, managed anger she usually reserved for board politics. "Cancel my 4 o'clock, she said. "I need an hour." She found Jack exactly where she expected to, under a car, and she stood in the open bay door for a moment, just watching his boots, feeling suddenly and strangely nervous in a way that made no sense for a woman who negotiated 8-figure contracts before lunch. "You didn't have to come," Jack said, without looking out from under the car, and she realized he'd heard her before she said anything. Of course he had. She was starting to notice things like that about him, small competencies he never drew attention to. "Robert doesn't get to do that," she said. "Show up at your work, threaten you." Jack slid out on the creeper, wiping his hands, and looked up at her from the concrete with an expression that wasn't quite what she expected. Not embarrassed, not defensive, careful. "He didn't threaten me, not really. He was fishing. For what?" "I don't know yet." That part was a lie, or close enough to one that it sat uncomfortably in his chest. He knew exactly what Robert had been fishing for, a thread to pull, a story that didn't add up, and he'd given him one, however small, the moment his eyes caught on the tattoo. Jack had spent 6 years making sure that particular thread stayed buried. He didn't like that a man with Robert's instincts had found the loose end in under 5 minutes. Vivian studied him, and something in her sharpened, the same instinct that had built a logistics empire out of noticing what other people missed. "You're hiding something," she said. Not an accusation, just an observation, quiet, almost gentle. "So are you," Jack said. "You never told me what happened with your board." "Not really. Just that they waited for you to fail." It landed the way he meant it to, not as deflection, but as an offer. "I'll trade you when you're ready." Vivian recognized the shape of it, because it was exactly the kind of quiet fairness she'd stopped expecting from people a long time ago. "Fair," she said softly. "But Jack, whatever Robert's looking for, he's going to find something. He always does. He's not doing this because he's curious about my personal life. He's doing it because he wants ammunition." Ammunition for what? Vivian hesitated, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked less like the composed CEO from the corner table and more like someone tired down to the bone. "There's a board vote in 6 weeks, a restructuring proposal. If it passes, they can push for new leadership, call it a transition, make it sound civil. Robert's been building support for months. He needs a reason the board will accept. Distracted, compromised judgment, something like that." She looked at him. "You, showing up in my life out of nowhere, right before the vote, that's not nothing to people looking for a story." Jack absorbed that in silence, turning it over the way he turned over any tactical problem, looking for the shape of the threat underneath the surface details. "So my existence is ammunition, only if we let it be," Vivian said, and there was something fierce under the words. Something that told him she'd already decided which side of that sentence she intended to land on. That evening, Jack picked Lily up from wrestling practice and found her sitting on the bleachers with her chin propped on her fists, watching the older kids run drills with unusual focus. "You're quiet," he said, sitting beside her. "Coach Denny said I have good instincts," she said. "Like you." Jack felt something tighten behind his ribs. An old, complicated feeling, pride braided together with something closer to fear. He'd spent years trying to make sure nothing about his past life ever touched her, and here it was anyway, showing up sideways in a comment from a well-meaning wrestling coach who had no idea what he was actually praising. "You inherited my stubbornness," Jack said lightly. "That's not the same as instincts." Lily gave him the look she reserved for adults who thought they were being clever. "Is Miss Vivian gonna come to my next match?" The question caught him off guard, mostly because he hadn't let himself think that far ahead. Hadn't let himself imagine Vivian sitting in the bleachers of a middle school gym, folded into plastic seats meant for parents who worried about carpool schedules and permission slips, not boardroom votes and inherited empires. But the image arrived anyway, unbidden and warm, and he found he wanted it more than he expected to. Would you want her to? Lily considered this with the seriousness she brought to all major decisions. She laughed at your joke about the mascot. Mom never laughed at your jokes. It wasn't said with any particular weight, just a child's flat observation, offered and released. But it landed on Jack like something much heavier. He hadn't talked about Lily's mother in a long time. He didn't now either. He just put his arm around his daughter's shoulders and let the practice noise fill the silence where an answer should have gone. Robert Ashworth's office overlooked the river, and he liked to stand at the window while he made calls, watching the water instead of the person on the other end of the line, a habit that gave him, he'd found, a useful appearance of unbothered patience. "I need everything on a Jack Coleman," he said. "Contractor, mechanic, coaches at a middle school. Started in this city about 6 years ago. Before that, nothing. I want to know what before that means." The private investigator on the other end asked the obvious question. Robert answered without turning from the window. "Because 6 years of nothing doesn't happen by accident," he said. "Men like that don't just appear. Find out where he was before he wasn't anywhere, and find it before the board vote." He hung up and allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, the expression of a man who had learned, over a long career, that everyone had a thread worth pulling, and that the quiet ones, the careful ones, the ones who never explained themselves, usually had the most interesting threads of all. Jack didn't know about the investigator yet. What he knew, lying awake that night with Lily's laughter about the mascot still echoing somewhere in his chest, was that the careful walls he'd built, logistics, coaching, quiet weekends, a life engineered specifically to never draw attention, had a crack in them now, and the crack had a name, and he didn't want to seal it shut even though every instinct he'd spent years honing told him he should. He thought about the file folder in the back of his closet, the one with a different name on it, the one he hadn't opened since the day he came home for good. He thought about how easy it would be for a man like Robert Ashworth, with enough money and enough motivation, to find his way to it eventually. Not the contents, never the contents. Those were sealed tighter than that. But the shape of it, the outline, enough to make Vivian's board very interested in exactly what kind of man had walked into her life 2 weeks before their vote. He picked up his phone and typed a text to Vivian before he could talk himself out of it. "There's something I should probably tell you. Not tonight, but soon." Her reply came faster than he expected and softer than he deserved. "Whenever you're ready. I'm not going anywhere." He set the phone down, and for a long time he just lay there in the dark, listening to Lily's soft breathing through the baby monitor he'd never quite been able to retire, thinking that he'd meant to keep this life simple, and understanding, with the particular ache of a man watching something good arrive at the worst possible time, that it wasn't simple anymore, and maybe it never really had been. Jack didn't tell her soon. He told himself he would. Every day for the next week, and every day something got in the way. A wrestling tournament, a transmission job that ran late, a moment that felt almost right, until Lily wandered into the kitchen and the words dissolved back into something safer. Vivian didn't push. She'd meant what she said about not going anywhere, and she showed it in small ways, showing up to his life instead of summoning him to hers, learning the names of the boys on Lily's wrestling team, remembering that Jack took his coffee black except on bad days, when he wanted it sweet. It was the ordinariness of it that undid him a little more each time. He'd spent 6 years building a life specifically designed to be unremarkable, and here was a woman who ran a company with 12,000 employees, sitting on his sagging porch steps eating gas station popsicles because Lily had declared it popsicle weather, looking more at peace than he suspected she ever looked in a boardroom. "You're staring," Vivian said, not opening her eyes, face tipped up toward the last of the sun. "I'm allowed to stare. You're allowed to talk, too, whenever you're ready." She said it lightly, but he heard the patience under it, the way she'd left the door open every day, without once walking through it herself to check if he'd moved. He almost did it then. He opened his mouth, and the porch light buzzed on overhead, automatic, startling them both. And Lily came barreling out the screen door mid-sentence about a wrestling move she wanted to show them, and the moment folded itself away again, gently, like it understood it wasn't wanted yet. Robert's investigator called on a Tuesday, and what he had wasn't much, not yet, but it was enough to make Robert set down his coffee and read the report twice. Subject's employment and residential history begins abruptly 6 years ago. No prior tax records, no prior address, no social media presence predating that period. Subject has a faded tattoo, consistent with military unit insignia, partially obscured, unable to confirm branch or unit without closer imaging. Recommend deeper background check. May require federal-level records request given apparent gap. Robert read the word federal 3 times, feeling something click into place with the satisfaction of a man who'd been right about someone all along. He didn't know what Jack Coleman was, but 6 years of nothing, dressed up as a mechanic who coached kids wrestling on the weekends, wasn't nothing. It was a story. And stories, Robert had learned over a long and successful career, could be shaped into whatever the audience needed them to be. Dangerous man, liability, security risk, exactly the kind of complication a nervous board would seize on 2 weeks before a vote. He picked up his phone and composed a careful, deniable message to 3 board members he trusted to be appropriately alarmed. Something you should see regarding Ms. Hale's personal associations. Strictly confidential. I thought you'd want to know before the vote. He attached the report and hit send before he could think better of it, though he never once considered thinking better of it. Men like Robert didn't second-guess the knife once it was already moving. The board members he'd chosen were the ones who mattered. Eleanor Voss, sharp-eyed and cautious. The kind who'd survived 3 CEOs by never committing to anything until she absolutely had to. And Desmond Cole, older, tired of change. The sort of man who found comfort in worrying about things he didn't fully understand. By Thursday morning, both had quietly requested an informal conversation with Vivian before the vote. No agenda specified, which in the language of Halewell's boardroom meant exactly the opposite of informal. Priya delivered the request with the careful, apologetic tone of a messenger who suspected the news was worse than she was allowed to say. They wouldn't say what it's about? They said it was about due diligence. Priya hesitated. Vivian, I think it's about Jack. Vivian sat very still for a moment, feeling something cold settle low in her stomach. Not fear exactly, but its close cousin. The particular dread of watching something good get pulled, uninvited, into a fight that had nothing to do with it, and everything to do with people who'd been waiting years for a reason. Get me everything Robert sent them, she said, and get me Jack. Jack arrived at her office that evening, still in his work clothes, grease under his nails, looking wildly out of place against the glass and steel of the 40th floor. And Vivian found, even now, even with everything closing in, that she was glad to see him, that the sight of him steadied something in her chest instead of complicating it further, exactly the opposite of what Robert wanted her to feel. They're calling it due diligence, she said, sliding the printed report across her desk. Robert sent this to 2 board members. He's building a case that you're a security risk, that I'm, his word, compromised. Jack picked up the report and read it in silence, his jaw tightening at federal-level records request. At the clinical, bloodless way 6 years of his life had been reduced to a paragraph of suspicion. He set it down carefully, the way he set down anything he didn't trust himself to hold too hard. He's not wrong that I'm hiding something, Jack said quietly. He's just wrong about what it means. Then tell me. Vivian's voice was steady, but her hands, folded on the desk, weren't quite. Not because Robert's forcing it, because I want to hear it from you before I hear a stranger's version of it in a boardroom. Jack looked at her for a long moment, at the woman who'd left the door open for 2 weeks, without once trying to force it, who was about to walk into a room and defend a man half her board thought was a liability, without knowing the full truth of who that man was. He thought about Lily, asleep at Marcus's house tonight, safe and unaware that her father's careful, boring life was about to crack open in a 40th floor office, with a view of the river. "I was in the army," he said. "Special operations, 12 years. He watched her absorb that, watched her wait for the rest, because she was smart enough to know that wasn't the part anyone was hiding. "The last few years, I wasn't just a soldier. I did close protection work, high-value targets, diplomats, people whose names you'd recognize if I said them, which I won't. I got good at reading rooms. Reading people. Knowing what's about to go wrong before it does." He paused. "I left because Lily's mother died, and I had a 6-month-old and a life that didn't have room in it for either of us anymore. I built this. The garage, the coaching, all of it, specifically so nobody would ever have a reason to ask me what I used to do." Vivian sat with that for a long moment, and Jack watched her face carefully, braced for the shift he'd seen before, the recalculation people did once they learned there was more to him than grease-stained hands and a sagging porch. But it didn't come the way he expected. "That's not a liability," she said finally, quiet and fierce. "That's exactly the kind of person Robert's been trying to convince everyone I don't have around me. Someone who actually pays attention. He's going to use it anyway. Let him try." Something had settled into her voice, steel under the warmth, the sound of a woman who'd spent a decade being underestimated and had finally found the one thing worth fighting for, without apologizing for it. "I built this company on knowing the difference between a risk and a reason to be afraid. Jack, you're not the first. You're the second." He almost asked what the first was. He didn't get the chance. Her phone buzzed on the desk, Priya's name lighting the screen, and when Vivian answered, her face changed in a way that told Jack, instantly, old instincts flaring before she'd said a word, that whatever came next wasn't going to wait for either of them to be ready. "They moved the board meeting up," Vivian said slowly, setting the phone down. "Tomorrow morning. Robert's calling it emergency session." She looked at Jack, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw something close to fear cross her face. Not for herself, he realized. For him. He's not waiting for the vote anymore. He's making his move now. Vivian didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen island with the lights off, city glow spilling through the windows, going over Robert's report, line by line, looking for the crack she could use against him, instead of the one he'd found in her. There wasn't much. That was the problem with men like Robert. They were careful, deniable, always one step removed from anything that could be traced back cleanly. An emergency board session called on due diligence grounds looked, on paper, like responsible governance. It would take real proof, not just conviction, to make it look like what it actually was. Her phone lit up at 6 a.m. with a text from Jack. "Whatever happens in there, I'm not going to hide from it. I'm done being someone's convenient secret." She read it twice, feeling something in her chest loosen and tighten at the same time. Pride and fear tangled together, indistinguishable. "You were never a secret," she typed back. "I just wasn't ready to share you yet." That's different. She meant it. She wasn't sure it would matter, not against a boardroom full of people who'd been waiting years for exactly this kind of opening. The emergency session convened at 9. 12 board members around a long table. Robert at the far end with the calm. Contained satisfaction of a man who believed he'd already won. Vivian walked in without Jack, they'd agreed, after a long argument on her porch at midnight, that his presence would only give Robert more to point at, more instability to name, and took her seat at the head of the table like she'd taken it 100 times before, because she had, and she wasn't about to let one bad morning change that. "Thank you all for accommodating the short notice," Robert began, and Vivian watched him work the room the way she'd watched him work rooms for years, never raising his voice, never overplaying his hand, just laying facts down one at a time, like cards in a hand he'd already counted. This isn't personal, it's governance. We have a responsibility to understand who has access to Ms. Hale's confidence, particularly during a leadership transition period. He doesn't have access to company information, Vivian said evenly. He's not an employee, a vendor, or a board member. He's someone I've been seeing socially for 3 weeks. 3 weeks during which, Robert said, sliding folders down the table with practiced ease, you've become, by multiple accounts, distracted, late to 2 meetings, absent from the Q3 strategy session. I'm not suggesting anything improper, Vivian. I'm suggesting the timing is worth examining, given what we've learned about Mr. Coleman's background. Eleanor Voss opened her folder without looking up. 6 years with no documented history before that. A tattoo, consistent with special operations insignia. No verifiable employment record, predating his arrival in this city. She said it flatly. An accountant, reading numbers, not an accusation, which somehow made it worse. I'd want to understand that before I felt comfortable moving forward with anything, Vivian, regardless of how you feel about him personally. He was a soldier, Vivian said. He did protection work for people whose names most of you would recognize, which is exactly why he can't hand you a resume to prove it. That's not a scandal. That's classified work performed by someone who came home and built an honest, quiet life afterward. If that's disqualifying, half this city's veterans should be disqualified from having neighbors. And if it's not the whole story, Robert said, gentle, reasonable, deadly. If there's more underneath that we simply haven't found yet? You're asking this board to take that risk on faith, 2 weeks before a restructuring vote, based on 3 weeks of personal acquaintance. It was a good line. Vivian felt the room shift slightly toward it, felt Desmond Cole's careful, worried nod, felt the temperature of the table cool by exactly the degree Robert had intended. She had built Halewell's crisis protocols herself, had trained half this room in exactly this kind of pressure, controlled, deniable, procedural, and she recognized, with a strange, distant clarity, that she was watching a masterclass in it now, aimed squarely at her. "I'll tell you what I know," she said, and let her voice go quiet instead of loud, because she'd learned a long time ago that quiet carried further in rooms like this. "I know a man who's raised a daughter alone for 6 years, without a single complaint. I know a man who apologized for a joke that wasn't his fault the moment he understood it. I know a man who told me the truth about his past the second I asked for it, without hiding behind procedure or plausible deniability." She looked directly at Robert. "I also know what it looks like when someone builds a case out of fear dressed up as caution. I've watched you do it before, Robert, just never quite this clumsily." The room went very still. Robert's composure didn't crack, not visibly, but something in his eyes sharpened, and Vivian understood she'd just made an enemy who'd been circling her for years finally decide the gloves were off. "I move," Robert said smoothly, "that we table any further personal discussion and proceed to a preliminary vote on the restructuring proposal, given the board's stated concerns about leadership focus." Eleanor's hand rose, slow and reluctant. Desmond's followed. 3 more after that. Vivian watched the count climb toward the threshold that would trigger a formal transition process, watched a decade of work start to slide toward a vote she might not survive, and felt, for the first time since she'd taken this chair after her father died, something close to real fear. The motion passed, 6 votes to 5, 1 abstention. Not enough to remove her outright, but enough to open a formal review, enough to hand Robert exactly the foothold he'd been building toward for months. "We'll reconvene in 2 weeks, Robert said, closing his folder with the calm satisfaction of a man precisely on schedule. "I hope, for everyone's sake, Ms. Hale, that the situation with Mr. Coleman resolves itself cleanly before then." She didn't call Jack until she was back in her office, door closed, the adrenaline finally draining out of her and leaving something colder and heavier behind. When he picked up, she could hear Lily laughing in the background, some ordinary evening noise from a life that felt, suddenly, very far away from the one she'd just walked out of. They opened a formal review, she said, and heard her own voice come out flatter than she meant it to. 2 weeks. If it goes badly, they can force a leadership transition. Because of me. Because of Robert, she corrected, sharper than she intended. Don't do that. Don't make this yours to carry. There was a long pause on the line, the sound of a door closing, Lily's laughter fading as Jack moved somewhere quieter. Vivian. If this costs you your father's company, it won't, she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it yet. But I need you to understand something. I'm not going to walk away from this to make it easier for them. I've spent my whole life being the reason people found to doubt something. My size, my age, being the daughter instead of the founder. I am not going to let Robert Ashworth add your name to that list too. Her voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word, and she hated that it did, and she let it anyway, because pretending with Jack had never worked the way it worked with everyone else. I just need to know you're not going anywhere, whatever the next 2 weeks look like. I'm not going anywhere, Jack said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before, not the careful stillness she'd grown used to, but something harder underneath it, something that sounded, for the first time, like a man deciding exactly how far he was willing to go to protect what mattered to him. But Vivian, if Robert wants to dig into who I really am, he's about to get a lot more than he bargained for. There are things about my old life I've kept buried because I wanted them buried, not because I couldn't handle them coming back up. Vivian went very still, hearing something shift underneath his words, an edge she hadn't known was there. What kind of things? The kind that don't stay quiet once certain people find out I'm alive and reachable again, Jack said. And for the first time, she heard something that sounded almost like a warning, not to her, but to whatever was coming. I was hoping I'd never have to use that version of myself again. The name came back to him at 2 a.m., the way old names always did, uninvited, fully formed, dragging memory behind it like a chain. Kessler. Jack sat up in the dark of his bedroom, heart steady but mind suddenly, fully awake, running calculations he hadn't run in 6 years. Daniel Kessler had been a contractor once, on the periphery of the same world Jack had worked in. Not military, never military, just a man who sold access and information to whoever paid best, and who'd crossed paths with Jack's unit badly enough, once, that it ended with Kessler in a federal facility and a grudge that Jack had assumed would stay buried along with everything else from that life. 6 years was a long time. Long enough for parole boards to do what parole boards did. Jack didn't know for certain Kessler was out. He knew that if Robert's investigator kept pulling threads, digging into federal-level records, it wouldn't take long before Jack's old case file surfaced, and Kessler's name was written all through it. He didn't sleep again that night. He sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, doing something he hadn't done since he came home. Mapping a threat the way he used to, methodically, without emotion, the version of himself he'd told Vivian he'd hoped never to need again. Lily found him there at 6, still in yesterday's shirt, and climbed into the chair across from him without asking why. You didn't sleep, she said. It wasn't a question. 7-year-olds noticed more than people gave them credit for. Just had some thinking to do. He closed the legal pad, folded his hands over it, and made himself smile the way he'd practiced for years. Steady, unbothered, a wall built specifically so she'd never have to see what was on the other side of it. You want pancakes, or are we doing cereal today? Pancakes. She studied him a moment longer, the same assessing look she'd given him the morning after the first date, and Jack felt, not for the first time, that his daughter saw more of him than he wanted her to. Is something wrong? Nothing you need to worry about, he said, and hated, quietly, that it was the same sentence his own father used to say to him, the same door closing gently on the same question, and he wondered if that was just what fathers did, or if he was failing at the one thing he'd promised himself he wouldn't repeat. Vivian called at 9, her voice tight, with something she was trying to keep out of it. Priya just told me Robert's investigator filed a federal records request yesterday afternoon. Formal, on the books. If it goes through, whatever's sealed about your service record won't stay sealed for long. Not from someone with Robert's resources and motivation. Jack closed his eyes. How long do we have? Days. Maybe a week, if we're lucky, and the request gets stuck in review. A pause. Jack, last night you said something about people finding out you're alive and reachable again. I need you to tell me what that means. All of it. I can't help you if I don't know what's coming. He told her about Kessler, carefully, the way he'd learned to deliver bad news to families who needed the truth, but not more of it than they could carry. A man from his old life, dangerous in a quiet, transactional way, someone who'd want to know exactly where Jack had landed if his name resurfaced in any official capacity. Not a certainty, a possibility, but a possibility Jack had spent 6 years specifically engineering his entire life to prevent. So, Robert's investigation doesn't just risk exposing your past, Vivian said slowly, putting it together the way she put everything together, fast and clean. It risks putting a target on you. And on Lily. Yes, the silence on the line stretched long enough that Jack checked to see if the call had dropped. When Vivian spoke again, her voice had changed, quieter, but harder. The sound of a woman recalculating an entire battlefield in real time. Then we stop the request, she said. Before it clears review, I still have people who owe me favors that have nothing to do with the board. Vivian, this isn't your fight. You made it my fight the day you walked into that restaurant and told me the truth, instead of letting me stay a joke, she said, sharp enough to cut through his protest cleanly. I am not going to sit in my office and let Robert Ashworth accidentally get your daughter hurt because he wanted leverage for a board vote. That's not a negotiation, Jack. That's just what's happening. He didn't have an answer for that. He wasn't sure he wanted one. He'd spent 6 years building walls, specifically, so no one would ever stand on the other side of them and say something like that. And now someone had. And instead of the old instinct to retreat, he felt something looser in his chest. Something that had been braced for a long time, finally allowing itself to unclench, just slightly. That afternoon, Vivian made 3 calls from her office with the door locked. One to a federal contact who'd sat on a Halewell logistics advisory panel for years and owed her more favors than either of them had bothered counting. One to her head of corporate security, a quiet, competent woman named Farah, who Vivian trusted more than most of her board. And one, finally, to her own attorney, laying groundwork for something she hadn't fully decided yet, but wanted ready regardless. I need eyes on a records request filed yesterday, she told her federal contact. Not to kill it, I know you can't do that cleanly, just to slow it down. A week, if you can manage it. Maybe less. This about the board situation Priya mentioned? It's about protecting someone Robert Ashworth is willing to endanger to win a vote, Vivian said. I'll explain the rest when I can. Right now, I just need the week. She got it. Not a promise, but a probably, which in this world was close enough to hold on to. That evening, Jack drove out to a storage unit on the edge of town, one he hadn't opened in 6 years, and stood in front of a metal locker with a combination he still remembered without trying. Inside was the version of himself Lily had never met, a sealed file box, an old go bag, a photo of a unit he didn't talk about, faces of men he still thought about more than he let on. He didn't take anything out. He just stood there for a long time, hand flat against the cold metal, deciding. He was still deciding when his phone buzzed. Marcus. Hey man, weird question. Some guy called my cousin asking about your old unit. Said he was doing background verification for a security clearance. Didn't sound like HR to me. You good? Jack read it twice, feeling the old cold clarity settle over him. The one that used to arrive right before things got very simple and very dangerous. Robert's investigator, moving faster than the federal request, working every angle he could find. Or something worse, Kessler's people, testing the edges, seeing if the name Jack Coleman connected to anything worth pursuing. He typed back a single line to Marcus. I'm good. Don't answer any more questions about me. Tell your cousin the same. Then he closed the storage locker, spun the combination lock, and drove home faster than he needed to, checking his mirrors the whole way in a habit he'd tried for 6 years to unlearn and never quite managed to. Lily was asleep by the time he got home, safe, unaware, one arm flung over her stuffed rabbit the way she'd slept since she was 2. Jack stood in her doorway for a long time, watching her breathe, and made a decision he'd been circling for days without letting himself land on it fully. Whatever came next, Robert, the board, Kessler, all of it, he wasn't going to let it reach her. Even if it meant becoming, one more time, the version of himself he'd buried the day he brought her home from the hospital and promised her a quiet life. He picked up his phone and texted Vivian one line before he turned off the light. I need to tell you the rest of it, all of it, tomorrow. Vivian came to him this time, at the house, after Lily had gone to bed at Marcus and Dana's for a sleepover that had been planned for weeks, and that Jack, for the first time, was grateful for. She sat across from him at the kitchen table where he'd mapped threats at 2 a.m. 2 nights before, and waited, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she wasn't drinking, while Jack decided where to start. 12 years active duty, he said finally. Last 4 of those, I ran close protection details for people the government didn't want photographed with security details, foreign officials, defectors, witnesses in cases that never made the news. I was good at it. Good enough that people started asking for me by call sign instead of name, which is its own kind of problem, because it means people remember you. He turned his coffee mug a quarter turn, the same old habit, and Vivian watched his hands instead of his face, because she'd learned by now that was where the truth lived. The op that ended it. I can't tell you where or who. I can tell you a man named Daniel Kessler was selling information to people who wanted a witness dead before trial. I was part of the team that stopped it. Kessler went to federal prison. I went home 3 weeks later because Lily's mother died in a car accident, and I had a 6-month-old and nothing left in me for that life anymore. And Kessler, Vivian said quietly, you think he's out. I think it's possible. I think if Robert's investigator pulls the wrong thread, my old case file resurfaces, and my name gets attached publicly to an operation that put a man like Kessler away for 6 years. Jack finally looked up at her. Men like that don't forget, and they don't come after soldiers who are still soldiers, protected, deployed, hard to reach. They come after the ones who went home, the ones who got soft targets. A house, a kid, a daily route to a wrestling gym anyone could learn in a week of watching. Vivian set her coffee down, very carefully, the way she set down things when she needed both hands free to think. Then we don't let Robert's investigation find that file. That's what I've been trying to prevent for 6 years without anyone doing it on purpose. Something dry and tired moved through his voice. I built this whole life to not need federal favors or connections. Just quiet. Just Lily and a garage and a wrestling gym. And now it's not quiet anymore, Vivian finished. Because of me. Because of a joke your board decided to weaponize, Jack said, sharper than he meant to. Don't take that on. I walked into that restaurant knowing exactly what I was risking. I chose to stay anyway. They sat with that for a moment, the kitchen quiet except for the refrigerator's hum, and Vivian reached across the table and took his hand. Not a grand gesture, just a small, steady one, the kind neither of them had offered anyone in a long time. "I have a security director," she said. "Farah. She used to run protective details for foreign executives before Halewell hired her. She's better connected than Robert's investigator, and she's loyal to me, not the board. I want her looking into whether Kessler's actually out, actually a threat, before we assume the worst. And I want her running a counter-surveillance sweep on you and Lily, quietly, starting tomorrow. Vivian, that's not a favor, Jack. That's not charity, and it's not you owing me anything." Her grip on his hand tightened slightly. "That's what people who care about each other do. You don't get to be the only one who's allowed to protect someone in this relationship." Something in Jack's chest loosened at that, some old, stubborn piece of armor giving way that he hadn't fully realized was still up. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay, Farah can look." Farah's report came back 2 days later, delivered in person, in Vivian's office, with the door locked, and Jack sitting in the chair, usually reserved for board members who mattered. "Daniel Kessler was released 11 months ago," Farah said, sliding a folder across the desk with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd delivered worse news in worse rooms. "Parole, clean record since, no violations on file, no known associates flagged, current address in another state, over 600 miles from here. No indication he's made any inquiries about Jack Coleman, this city, or anyone connected to either." She paused. "That doesn't mean there's no risk. Men like that sometimes wait years before they act, if they act at all. But right now, today, there's no evidence he's looking." Jack felt something in his shoulders come down half an inch, not fully, not enough to stop checking mirrors, but enough to breathe. "So the real threat right now isn't Kessler." "The real threat right now," Farah said, looking between the two of them, "is Robert Ashworth's investigator, who filed a federal records request that's still sitting in review, and who's apparently reached out to at least 2 more people in Jack's old life, asking informal questions. That's not illegal exactly. It's aggressive and it's reckless, and if it succeeds, it doesn't just expose Jack's service record, it potentially exposes operational details that are still classified, which is a federal matter regardless of what Robert intended." Vivian went very still. "He could be committing a crime and not even realize it. Or realize it and not care, because he thinks the payoff is worth it," Farah said. "Either way, that request needs to die before it clears review. I have a contact who can flag it for extended classification review. Buys another 2 weeks, maybe 3. But Vivian, that only delays it. It doesn't stop Robert from finding another way in." Jack sat with that for a moment, turning the shape of the problem over the way he used to turn over tactical maps, not looking for a way around it, looking for the pressure point that made the whole structure collapse at once. "Then we stop giving him a locked door to pick," Jack said slowly. "We stop hiding the parts of this that don't actually need to stay hidden." Vivian looked at him carefully. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Robert's whole strategy depends on me being a mystery," Jack said. "A gap in the record. Something suspicious because it's unexplained. What if it stops being unexplained? Not the classified parts, those stay buried, they have to, but the parts I've spent 6 years hiding out of habit, not necessity, my service, why I came home, what I actually am, instead of what Robert gets to imply I might be." He looked at Vivian, something settling into place behind his eyes, calm and deliberate. A man choosing, finally, to stop running the same old defense. He wants a scandal. Let's not give him a story to write. Let's tell it first. They decided to do it publicly, on Vivian's terms, in a way Robert couldn't spin. Not a press release, too clinical, too much like an admission of guilt. A gala. Halewell's annual charity dinner, 3 days before the board's reconvened vote. 400 guests, half the board in attendance. Cameras from 2 business outlets covering the event. because Vivian Hale's charity galas always drew coverage. "You don't have to do this in front of everyone," Vivian said, adjusting his tie in the hotel suite before the event, her hands steadier than her voice. "We could still do this quietly. A statement. A private meeting with the board." "Robert doesn't do quiet," Jack said. "He does whispers he can deny later. I want this loud enough that there's nothing left for him to whisper about." He caught her hands, stilled them against his chest. "Besides, I'm tired of being someone's secret. Even a good one." She kissed him then, brief and fierce, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, that whatever happened in the next few hours would either end Robert's campaign completely or hand him exactly the spectacle he needed to finish it. The ballroom was full by 8, Halewell's board scattered among round tables draped in white, Robert seated near the front with the relaxed posture of a man who believed himself moments from victory. Vivian took the small stage at 8:30, as planned, for what everyone assumed would be the usual remarks about the Foundation's work, until she didn't give those remarks at all. "Before we get to tonight's program," she said, voice carrying clean and steady across the room, "I want to address something directly, because I'm done letting other people tell this story on my behalf." A ripple moved through the room. Robert's posture changed almost imperceptibly, a man recalculating in real time. 3 weeks ago, I was set up on what my date's friends thought was a joke, a blind date between a CEO and a mechanic, arranged for laughs at his expense, Vivian continued. "Since then, that man has been investigated, followed, and quietly threatened by members of my own leadership, because they decided his background made him a convenient story to attach to a board vote they wanted to win, regardless of the truth." She let that land, watched Robert's jaw tighten fractionally. "So tonight, instead of letting a manufactured scandal decide who I'm allowed to care about, I'd like you to actually meet him." Jack walked up from the side of the stage, and the room did the thing rooms did when they were confronted with someone they'd only heard rumors about. A low murmur, 100 quiet recalculations happening at once. "My name is Jack Coleman," he said, and his voice, trained across years of talking calmly to terrified people in the worst moments of their lives, carried without needing to be raised. "For 12 years I served in the United States Army, the last 4 in a role I still can't discuss in detail, because the work involved protecting people whose safety depended on nobody knowing my name. I came home 6 years ago because my daughter's mother died, and she needed a father more than the world needed whatever I used to be. Since then, I've fixed cars and coached wrestling and tried to build a quiet, honest life for my daughter." He paused, letting his eyes move deliberately toward Robert's table. "Recently, someone decided that quiet life made me suspicious, that the fact I couldn't explain myself made me dangerous, rather than simply someone who kept a promise to his country. That man filed a federal records request attempting to expose classified operational history, not to protect this company, but to manufacture a crisis he could use against a woman who's done nothing but run this company honestly since the day her father died." The room had gone fully silent now, 400 people watching Robert's face for a reaction he was visibly failing to fully control. "I'm not going to apologize for who I was," Jack said, "and I'm not going to let anyone use my daughter, my service, or my privacy as a weapon against someone I care about." He looked at Vivian, something warm cutting through the formal weight of the moment. "So here I am. No more secrets. Do with that whatever you want." The room erupted into a controlled, murmuring chaos, the specific sound of a scandal deflating in real time, robbed of its ammunition by simply being said out loud. Eleanor Voss, near the front, was already leaning toward Desmond Cole, expression tightening as she reread whatever calculus had gotten her to vote against Vivian 3 days earlier. A journalist near the back was typing rapidly, and Vivian understood, with grim satisfaction, that Robert's version of the story had just been permanently overwritten by a truer, better one. Hero, not liability. Robert stood, smoothing his jacket, and crossed toward the stage with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything, though Vivian could see, underneath it, something brittle finally starting to crack. "Quite a performance," he said quietly, close enough that only Vivian and Jack could hear. "Very moving. Doesn't change the fact that a records request is still in federal review, or that classified information may still surface regardless of your little speech." "It won't," said a new voice, and Farah stepped forward from where she'd been standing at the edge of the stage, folder in hand. "Because I spent the last 3 days documenting exactly how you obtained the information in your original report, Robert. Your investigator accessed sealed personnel records through a contact at a defense contractor who did not have clearance to share them. That's not aggressive due diligence. That's a federal violation, and I have the paper trail." She held the folder out, not to Robert, but to the 2 board members standing nearest. "I'd be happy to walk the board through it tonight, if anyone would like to see it before the vote." Robert's composure finally, visibly, cracked. Not into anger, but into something colder and more calculating, the look of a man watching every card in his hand turn to nothing at once. "This is a private matter," he said. "Board business doesn't get settled at a gala." "No," Vivian agreed, "but it gets started here. And it ends in 3 days, in the room it belongs in, with the truth already sitting in front of everyone instead of buried where you tried to keep it." She looked at him, steady, unhurried. Years of being underestimated finally paying out in exactly this moment. "You spent months trying to make me look weak for who I choose to love, Robert. Congratulations, you've just handed the board a very clear picture of which one of us actually deserves to run this company." The reconvened board meeting 3 days later drew a full room, all 12 members present, plus, at Vivian's insistence, Jack seated quietly in the gallery chairs usually reserved for legal counsel. She hadn't asked his permission so much as informed him he was coming, and he hadn't argued, because he understood, finally, that this was a fight she needed him present for, not absent from. Robert opened as if nothing had changed, laying out the restructuring proposal with the same careful, deniable language he'd used before: leadership focus, governance responsibility, shareholder confidence. But the room had shifted under him, and everyone could feel it. Eleanor Voss interrupted him 20 minutes in. "Before we proceed," she said, "I'd like Farah Nasser to present what she found regarding how the original background report was obtained." Robert's jaw tightened. "That's not on today's agenda." "I'm making it the agenda," Eleanor said, and something in her flat, precise voice told the room she'd already made her decision, and made it days ago. "I voted to open this review because I believed we were protecting the company from an unknown risk. I want to understand whether we were actually protecting the company or whether we were used." Farah's presentation took 11 minutes. She laid it out with the same clinical thoroughness she'd used in Vivian's office: the improperly accessed personnel file, the defense contractor employee who'd since been placed on leave pending federal inquiry, the timeline showing Robert's outreach to board members beginning within hours of receiving information he had no legal right to possess. By the time she finished, Desmond Cole had his head in his hands, and 2 other board members Vivian had never fully trusted were exchanging the specific, uncomfortable glances of people realizing they'd nearly attached their names to something ugly. "I'd also like to note," Farah added, closing her folder, "that Mr. Coleman's service record, the parts that aren't classified, confirm 12 years of honorable service and multiple commendations, none of which constitute any risk to this company. If anything, Ms. Hale has demonstrated better judgment in her personal associations than this board demonstrated in its due diligence process." Robert stood, color rising in his face for the first time since Jack had met him. "This is character assassination dressed up as procedure. I acted in the company's interest." "You acted to secure a leadership vote you knew you couldn't win honestly," Vivian said, quiet, final. "You didn't investigate a risk, Robert." You manufactured one out of a man's private history and a joke your friends thought was funny, because you needed a reason and you didn't particularly care whether it was true. She looked around the table, meeting each board member's eyes in turn, the way her father used to when he wanted a room to remember exactly who was speaking. I'm not going to pretend I haven't made mistakes running this company. I have, and I'll own every one of them. But I have never once lied to this board, manipulated evidence, or violated federal law to protect my position. I'd like the record to reflect the difference. The vote, when it finally came, wasn't close. 9-3 to reject the restructuring proposal entirely, and a separate, unanimous motion. Even Robert couldn't bring himself to vote against it, not with Farah's folder still sitting open on the table. To refer the improperly obtained records matter to outside counsel for review. Robert didn't wait for the meeting to formally close. He gathered his folder, said nothing, and walked out of the boardroom for what everyone in the room understood, without anyone saying it aloud, was very likely the last time. Vivian found Jack in the hallway afterward, leaning against the window with the particular stillness of a man who'd been holding something tightly for a long time and had only just allowed himself to let it go. "It's over," she said. "Really over. Legal's already drafting his separation agreement." "You didn't need me in there," Jack said. "You handled that on your own. I needed you there anyway." She stepped closer, close enough that the hallway's noise faded into something distant and unimportant. "For 6 months I've been sitting in that boardroom being underestimated by people who decided what I was before I opened my mouth. You never did that, not once, not from the first night, when you didn't even know who I was and treated me like I mattered anyway." Her voice caught, just slightly. "I don't know how to explain what that's worth to someone who hasn't spent a decade being the joke in the room." "I think I know a little something about that," Jack said quietly, and something passed between them that didn't need further explaining. Two people who'd spent years building careful, guarded lives, specifically because the world kept deciding who they were, before they'd been given the chance to show it. "Robert's gone," Vivian said. "Kessler's a state away and hasn't made a move in 11 months, whatever we were protecting ourselves from. I think for the first time in a long time, there's nothing actually chasing us anymore." Jack reached for her hand, turned it over gently, the same careful attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. "Then maybe it's time we stopped acting like there is." That evening, Lily met Vivian properly for the first time. Not a hurried porch visit or a name mentioned in passing, but a real dinner. Spaghetti Jack made badly and everyone ate anyway, laughter filling a kitchen that had been quiet for 6 years, in a way none of them had fully noticed until it wasn't quiet anymore. "You're the CEO lady," Lily announced, studying Vivian with the same frank assessment she brought to broken kites and bad days. "Dad said you're really smart." "Your dad's pretty smart too," Vivian said. "He just hides it under a lot of grease and bad jokes about mascots." Lily laughed, delighted, and looked between the two adults with the satisfied expression of a child who'd just confirmed something she'd suspected for a while. "Are you going to come to my wrestling match on Saturday?" Vivian looked at Jack, who nodded, something soft and unguarded moving across his face in a way Vivian hadn't seen since the night at the diner when he'd talked about his daughter without meaning to make himself look good. "I wouldn't miss it," Vivian said, and meant it more than she'd meant almost anything in years. Saturday's wrestling match started at 10, and Vivian arrived at 9:30, early enough to claim a spot on the bleachers next to Marcus and Dana, who greeted her with the slightly sheepish warmth of people who still hadn't fully lived down the joke that started everything. "For the record," Marcus said, settling in beside her with 2 coffees, handing her one without asking, "I take full credit for this. Best terrible idea I've ever had." "You set your friend up on a date to embarrass him," Vivian said, but she was smiling when she said it, because 6 months ago, the sentence would have stung, and now it just sounded like the beginning of a story she was glad had happened. In my defense, I had no idea I was accidentally matchmaking a war hero with the most underestimated CEO on the East Coast. Marcus grinned. Some men just have a gift. Lily won her match in the second period, a takedown that made half the gym erupt. And when she looked up into the stands afterward, breathless and grinning around her missing front teeth, it wasn't Jack she looked for first. She found Vivian's face in the crowd and pointed, delighted, like she needed someone to confirm the moment actually happened. Vivian stood and clapped until her hands hurt, and felt something settle into place in her chest that she hadn't fully had words for until just then. The particular, quiet joy of being someone a child looked for. Halewell's transition, once Robert's departure was finalized, went smoother than Vivian expected. Eleanor Voss, of all people, became one of her strongest allies on the board, the two of them developing an unlikely, business-like respect built on the specific honesty of having watched each other survive a crisis without flinching. The federal review into the improperly obtained records closed within 2 months. No charges against Jack. Nothing to charge, since he'd done nothing but come home and live quietly. And a quiet but firm note in his file, confirming his service had been, in every way that mattered, honorable. Kessler never surfaced. Farah kept a loose watch for another year out of professional caution, and eventually even that faded into the background of an ordinary, unremarkable life, which was, Jack reflected more than once, exactly what he'd wanted all along. He'd just needed someone to help him see he didn't have to build that life entirely alone. The garage got a little smaller in Jack's life over the following year, not because he stopped loving the work, but because he started splitting his time, 3 days turning wrenches, 2 days consulting quietly for Halewell's corporate security division at Vivian's request, using 12 years of expertise the company genuinely needed and that he found, to his own surprise, he didn't mind using again, now that it was in service of building something instead of guarding against loss. "You don't have to do this," Vivian told him the day she offered, half expecting him to say no out of old habit. "I know," Jack said. "I want to. There's a difference between hiding what I used to be and choosing when to use it. I think I finally understand that." He looked at her, something settled and sure in his face that hadn't been there the night he'd walked into the amber room bracing for a punchline. "Besides, somebody around here needs to make sure your security team isn't just people in suits standing near doors." They married the following spring, a small ceremony in the backyard of the house Jack still refused to sell, despite Vivian's teasing offers of something grander. 30 guests, Marcus as best man, still insisting on some credit for the whole thing. Lily as flower girl, taking her job with the same fierce seriousness she brought to wrestling matches and broken kites. "You may kiss the bride," the officiant said, and Jack did, gently, like he still couldn't quite believe 6 months of careful walls had ended up here, in his own backyard, with the woman who'd never once asked him to be anything other than exactly who he was. Afterward, Lily tugged on Vivian's dress, insistent, until Vivian crouched down to her level. "Are you my mom now?" Lily asked, with the blunt, searching honesty of a child who'd waited a long time to ask. Vivian glanced at Jack, who nodded, throat tight, and looked back at Lily with the same steady warmth she'd offered from the very first dinner. "I'd like to be, if that's okay with you." Lily considered this with great seriousness, then nodded once, decisively, the way she decided most important things. "Okay, but you still have to come to all my matches. Every single one," Vivian promised, and meant it more than she'd meant almost any promise in her life, including several worth considerably more money. 2 years later, on a quiet Sunday morning, Jack stood in the kitchen making pancakes, still badly, still with love, while Vivian sat at the counter, with a coffee and a newborn son asleep against her shoulder, and Lily, 9 now, all elbows and opinions, narrated a story about her wrestling team's chances at regionals with the total confidence of someone who'd never once doubted her own worth, because nobody in this house had ever given her reason to. Jack watched them both for a moment, spatula forgotten in his hand, and thought about a version of himself 6 years gone. A man who'd built a whole quiet life around never being seen, never being known, never risking what he had left to lose. He thought about a joke that was supposed to embarrass him, and a woman who'd looked at him across a restaurant table and decided, before she knew a single true thing about him, that he deserved better than being a punchline. "You're burning the pancakes," Vivian said, not looking up. "I know," Jack said, smiling anyway, "and let it burn a little longer, because for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wasn't in any hurry at all.